Hello, you're watching Head to Head, and I'm Michael Bociurkiw. After Russia annexed Crimea and started a hybrid war in the Donbas back in 2014, the international community reacted with messages of support for Ukraine and economic sanctions against the aggressor. But this did not persuade the Kremlin to review its aggressive policy towards Ukraine. On November 25th, Russia committed an act of non-hybrid but open aggression by attacking and seizing 3 Ukrainian vessels near the Kerch Strait. The West was once again unanimous in its condemnation of Russia's aggressive actions and demands freedom of navigation be restored. But will it increase pressure on Ukraine's aggressor state? To talk more about the international reaction to Russian aggression, we welcome to the studio today Michael Bociurkiw, global affairs analyst and writer. He also served as a spokesperson for the OSCE Special Monitoring Mission to Ukraine. Hello, and thank you for being with us today.
Pleasure.
It's a pleasure to have you here. So I've just reminded our audience about that blatant violation of international laws and human rights in the Kerch Strait. 24 Ukrainian sailors are held captive now. They were in Kerch first, but after Russian authorities saw that local residents support these sailors, they transferred them to Moscow. So after this incident, no additional sanctions were imposed against Russia, only the individual ones. Why so?
Well, of course, we heard a lot of rhetoric in the aftermath of this incident, a very serious incident. Of course, it was the first time that Russia has openly confronted Ukraine since 2014. And yeah, there was loud statements from the UN Security Council, as you know, from European capitals, from Ottawa, Washington. But I'm afraid that a lot of that was not backed up by action. Hence, the Russians, probably other countries too, rogue states or authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia, among others, China, feel that they can act with abandon and not suffer any consequences. So I think what Ukraine and some Central and Eastern European countries would have expected out of this, again, grave violation of international law, is something going beyond sanctions, really tough restrictions against not the number 20th Russian bank, but one of the top Russian banks. Also restrictions, such things as Russians buying property in the United Kingdom, in the United States, travel restrictions, that sort of thing. But it's sad to say that did not happen. And I feel Ukraine probably feels very alone right now and may be tempted to take matters in its own hands. But I think it's a kind of comment on the state of affairs right now in the international community where things stand.
So we think that this is a matter of negotiations. So we have to keep negotiations about this, maybe sanctions to be imposed in the future? Or?
Well, I think Ukraine has kept up the heat on its allies and has really put forward a convincing case for more sanctions. But frankly speaking, sanctions in the countries that introduce them, let's say from Europe, they do also cause economic pain at home. And you saw what's going on right now in France, for example. In other European countries, people are protesting against joblessness and higher prices, that sort of thing. So that's why I think the political will isn't there for more tighter sanctions that may cause economic harm in the countries.
You mentioned UN Security Council, and you mentioned also that China was among those countries who supported Russian agenda on that meeting. Why do you think China decided to support Russia?
Well, they're supporting Russia because they're both playing from the same playbook. If I always compare, what's happening out here, Russian aggression, to China's aggressive activities in the South China Sea.
That's true.
Which is the claims there are from a number of Southeast Asian countries.
They're doing the same, basically.
Yeah, and what China
Russia does in Ukraine.
Really occupying these islands, building airports there, landing strips, increasing their military presence. So it's and then right now, I mean, as we speak, China is seizing innocent Canadian citizens in China, apparently in retaliation to the Canadian arrest, according to a U.S. extradition request, to a Chinese executive in Vancouver. So these are very worrisome times, I would say.
Well, so China wouldn't go against Russia because it's also having the same policy towards some issues. But on the other hand, China and Ukraine started working on some kind of new trade relations.
Yeah.
And after China proposed to develop free trade area between the two countries, and in this regard, maybe Ukraine would like to expect some support from China. But speaking about sailors, again, speaking about this incident, how to return Ukrainian sailors, and keeping in mind that Russians do not even care about breaching the Geneva Convention, because these sailors, we know that they are recognized as prisoners of war and they cannot be tried, but we see that they already have this, they are detained and they have this period in detention until the court trial continues. Yeah, well,
the signal there is this will be a long, drawn-out affair. Russia is going to use them as bargaining chips. For the time being, I don't think, while these men are in detention, that Ukraine can't really try any kind of aggressive behavior in the Sea of Azov. And, the other thing I should say is that, this was kind of in the making for quite some time. Russia was creating huge problems for Ukrainian commercial activities in the Sea of Azov. The building of the bridge has also limited movement of Ukrainian vessels there. So it doesn't look good. My feeling is that Russia may be moving to actually occupying the entire Sea of Azov, so forcibly annexing it. Yes. And if not that, maybe even going after that land bridge. Now, the other worrisome scenario some analysts have put out is that bridge that was built across the Kerch Strait isn't actually that engineeringly sound. And should something happen to it, the Ukrainians might be blamed for it if the bridge collapses, for example, and then that would be a trigger for Russia to take even more aggressive action. So we're headed, excuse the pun, but into very stormy waters at the moment with this one.
Yes, and actually the similar assessment of the situation was from the President Petro Poroshenko, and also Ukrainian intelligence also provided the report that probably Russia would like to occupy the whole Sea of Azov and maybe even this Ukrainian territory where this two city ports port cities, Mariupol and Berdansk, are located.
Yeah, and again, that's why the international community should stand on principle and penalize them for doing so, because, also Poroshenko, by the way, has called for NATO to send its vessels closer to the Sea of Azov. But I think NATO has made it clear, again, despite all of their rhetoric, that they're not prepared to push the line on that one.
Well, today they talked with the President Poroshenko talked with the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and it was stated that NATO will help strengthen the Ukrainian Navy, so we can expect some new communication equipment. Other than that, yes, I wanted to ask, would we expect some ships to observe the situation in the Black Sea, or not from the NATO?
Well, that
because
would be
Britain
good.
and the United States, they are planning on sending ships to the Black Sea area, that we know. But what about NATO?
Well, the big problem here is the lack of capability on the Ukrainian Navy side. I think this is something that has been severely neglected by the Poroshenko administration. In fact, as I said in my CNN piece recently, is that it took Poroshenko a while to accept those two Navy ships, which was a gift from the United States. So hence, they don't have the preparedness, and the Russians know that very well. And again, I don't think, I think there's a limit to how far NATO and other countries will go to provoking the Russians. They usually,
especially Ukraine is not really a member of NATO, just an aspirant country.
Yeah. But again, it is important to stand up for principle and show them that there's a line that you cannot cross.
That is true.
And then, because they will do it again and again and again.
Well, among all the statements and condemnations after this incident, I would like to outline the reaction of Lithuania, because the Lithuanian parliament adopted a resolution demanding tougher and expanded sanctions against the Kremlin. And part of this document calls on Russia, of course, to release the Ukrainian sailors, these prisoners of war, and also the political prisoners. And if Moscow does not fulfill these requirements in the nearest future, and EU and NATO countries would impose new sanctions on the Russian gas and financial sectors. But what is very interesting to me, in this resolution, it is also included this aspect, this paragraph about the exclusion the Russian Federation from the SWIFT system. So what should happen with this resolution for these measures mentioned to be imposed?
Yeah, well, I would say the exclusion of Russia from SWIFT is is on the extreme of the tools available to the international community to sanction Russia.
So this is very extreme sanction.
Very extreme. It would rattle, I'm sure, the financial system. Of course, it would really hurt Russian banks, Russian individuals, their ability to travel.
Let's explain our audience what is this SWIFT system about and what this would mean, this exclusion.
Well, basically, it's the guts of the financial transaction system in the world, where money flows, where people can make wire transfers, where credit card transactions can happen, that sort of thing, controlled in Europe and Brussels. But for a member country, to be tossed out of that is going to really, really severely hurt them. And I think there are fears in European capitals that if that were to be done, then they would take retaliatory measures, or perhaps it would just create too much disruption. But there are other ways, as I mentioned, to penalize them. And I think the one thing that Putin is really afraid of is more restrictions on himself and his circle of cronies. So anything that prevents them from things like buying properties, travel, but especially using those shell companies, LLCs, to funnel money, to launder money, and buy things like expensive property in London. Well, that's what would really hurt if they could cut that off. Now, I know there are, in recent weeks, measures by the British to call for more transparency in commercial property transactions in the United Kingdom. And I think that is long overdue, especially after what happened in Salisbury and elsewhere. So I think that's what we may see happen, is more moves in those directions. But for SWIFT, I don't think they're going to touch it.
But still, speaking of this resolution by the Lithuanian parliament, can it somehow travel to the European Parliament? Can the European Parliament also review it? Or this resolution is just the statement of the Lithuanian?
I think the Europeans are quite distracted right now with what's happening with Brexit, because it's a huge thing for them.
Yes.
But I think, in fairness to our neighbors in the Baltics, I would be very worried if I were them, because if you see this type of Russian aggression in the Sea of Azov, they aren't far away from this, and they could do that. The other thing I should mention quickly is Nord Stream 2. At the Tiger conference the day before yesterday, there was a lot of talk of Germany putting it on hold for at least a year in retaliation for what Russia has been doing. Again, I don't know if the political will is there in Germany right now, but that would really, really hurt the Russian side too.
Apart from Germany, what other countries do advocate the most for this Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline?
Well, the idea of this pipeline is to sell gas to Europe. So a lot of the economies would be affected by this. So that's why I think they're being so careful about what's going to happen to that pipeline. It's a multi-billion-dollar effort. But, if you take the view that Russia is protecting its interest in the Sea of Azov and giving a very wide definition to their sphere of influence, it could also conceivably do the same thing around the pipeline, the Nord Stream 2.
Exactly. So how can these countries understand this?
Well, I think they should have understood it before contracts were signed. This should have happened a long time ago. But sad to say, sometimes economic interest takes precedence over political ones.
That is true. That is true. Also, you already mentioned, you already remembered about this Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline construction, and the United States, the members of the U.S. House of Representatives have passed 2 resolutions in support of Ukraine also recently, and it's also about this Russian aggression and the Kerch Strait, and about this construction of this Nord Stream 2. Of course, I do understand that the United States, they also have their own interest in this gas supply drama around Europe, because they would like to also to sell their gas, but this is really crucial topic for Ukraine, probably for the security situation.
Sure, and I should also throw in here that Trump's behavior in regards to Russia has been despicable. A lot of analysts, including myself, really do feel that there's more here than meets the eye, that perhaps they do have some kind of compromat on him, or he puts his own business interests over everything else. But
do you think there is a collusion with him?
I don't know, but he hasn't done much to convince us that there's not. And I think as more evidence comes out from the Mueller probe, for example, we will see how closely the Russians actually colluded with at least Team Trump in the run-up to the elections.
Well, speaking of Ukraine, How would you assess the work of Ukrainian diplomats maybe on this international arena, trying to persuade the partners to, to increase pressure on Russia, somehow to support Ukraine, to express this condemnation?
Yeah, well, look, I have really tremendous respect for Ukrainian diplomats. I know many of them. Many of them are my friends. The foreign minister is really talented. The problem is that, look, a lot of Ukrainian embassies are under-resourced and, don't have proper spokespeople, for example. And, there was a long time after Poroshenko was inaugurated where key embassies and key capitals around the world were left vacant, no ambassador. So I think he had a late start in terms of, Ukrainian diplomatic activities starting under his watch. But no, they're doing a great job. There's a very active Ukrainian permanent presence in the UN, for example. But we were talking about this morning on Hromadske radio, is that Ukraine really needs to up its game in terms of getting its story out, in terms of getting its narrative. And it isn't only up to diplomats, it's also up to having spokespersons, even people who are not diplomats, people in Hollywood, for example, to really push hard. I mean, look what George Clooney did, for example, in terms of highlighting the problems in South Sudan or Darfur. It has huge impact. And, people like him and Angela Jolie can go to the United Nations and really push forward strong messages. Ukraine needs to move the same way.
Yes, it is very important when celebrities do join this movement to fight for some judiciary in this world. Just to conclude our conversation, because we unfortunately run out of time, what ways do you see for Ukraine to possibly solve this problem with the territorial integrity, with the conflict in the east of Ukraine, and what ideas about sanctions for future sanctions do you see to be effective?
Well, it's a very complicated question to answer in a short amount of time. But with all due respect to the OSCE and other diplomats that negotiated that agreement, the Minsk agreement almost isn't worth the ink that's signed on the paper. It isn't being respected. Daily violations, read any OSCE daily report. So I think we're heading into a tricky time right now with the elections coming up in the end of March. You'll have a kind of lame duck president there as well. So, but it's really, really important for Ukraine and its allies to advocate strongly that these sailors be released. And then secondly, of course, that, the territory, international territory be respected, commercial passage be respected in the Sea of Azov.
Well, thank you so much for your interesting and valuable comments. Thank you for being a guest today in our studio.
Thank you.
That was Michael Bociurkiw, Global Affairs Analyst and Writer. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Kerch Strait. Goodbye.